Good evening. It's first of all, it's such a pleasure. There are two or three pleasures here. The first one is that the microphone is working. And I guess there's just one more. Well, it's also such a pleasure to be here for the final lecture. Not that that's the pleasure part, but I'd like to congratulate the second-year graduate students for an absolutely fabulous job this fall and in the summer in organizing and putting on this lecture series. If we could all thank them. And then the final pleasure for me is to introduce I guess a third friend and best friends in this lecture series. Two people that go way back for me, but I will also say go way back for all of you. It's rare when you find in your life individuals who affect you in a very, very powerful way. For me, it was extremely direct. With Craig and I were partners for a number of years. I think I ticked off the client one too many times, and Craig did his fair share of that too. But we had some fabulous times. I will always consider Craig to be one of my teachers. I remember the first project that we worked on together, although I was really working for both Craig and Lester back in New York, one floor above Andy Warhol's studio and 4 floors below Saul Steinberg's studio. And I was building the model for a project, and the model looked like, well, it didn't look that great. And Craig came over and sort of said, you should probably do this and this, and we continued to work on it, and actually looked halfway decent when it was done. That little incident, Craig will barely remember, made a lasting impression on me. For all of you, well, and then there's a couple of other, I won't tell all the stories here. They have a better story to tell, the story of their own work. There are two stories of dangling legs. One is of Craig got me to chase after cars, although he'll claim that I was also interested in this, but I became interested, or was forced to, and then I finally sort of bought one of these old Italian cars, which of course didn't have good electrical system in it. And our first outing, which was to chase after a party at Cal Arts, and we had gone over the top of the thing on the 405, and we're going down, and the electrical system started to fail, at which point Craig shimmied down in the seat with his head underneath the dashboard without a flashlight, but with probably some matches, and proceeded to more or less fix the whole affair, although we decided, being conservative architects, not to continue out to Cal Arts and sort of limp on home. Ming's dangling legs occurred during a party in our old studio on Rose when we were hosting Alice Aycock, the artist, and Ming talked us into 12 Beijing ducks, which were strung across the studio, dangling maybe by their necks. Was it their necks, Ming? Possibly. The part that you don't realize so much, but maybe you do, in terms of your lives, I'll say the lives of students and a number of faculty and practitioners here, is that both Craig and Ming have influenced work in architecture tremendously, both within this community of Los Angeles, within our family at SCI-Arc. Sometimes silly little things like a technique of smearing stuff over some cardboard, sometimes in a, I wouldn't say necessarily more profound way, but maybe a more theoretical way of how one actually assembles and thinks about works of architecture. Their work is, I feel, very much in all of our work, and we look to them and continue to look to them for leadership in the field. It has been a long struggle, longer for Craig than Ming, since he's older, to get where they have gotten to today. It's been one in which they've had faith in their work and had a small circle of people which also believed in their work, and the work now has come to the forefront, and we look forward to seeing the work tonight, but also seeing the work in the future. And I would like now to introduce the two very fine friends of mine, Craig Hodgetts and Hsinming Fung.
Thanks, Rob. Very nice. Are we on?
Yes, we are on.
Can we have that sign?
Yeah, the sign
Can
right
we have
up
that
in the
sign?
front, the H press F.
We need one for our studio. It's great. Well, since this is Nostalgia Week, it actually gave us an opportunity to sort of think about a lot of things, and we actually decided that this is really be careful what you wish for time, because when Robert and Lester and I began our little studio in New York, it was the high pitch of transitory architecture. Archigram was running around talking about instant cities, and Robert put together something that was called, I forget what it was called, some kind of whiz-bang city, which was going to happen literally overnight. And so this level of transitory work was something we were really motivated for. Like, we were just going for it like crazy. And we're stuck with it. So we were also very much under the thrall of a kind of something where provenance was something to sneer at. One of the very first things that I did was buy this very beautiful Richard Sapper radio, which had just come out. It's a museum item now, you know, and I listened to it and I thought, this really sounds bad. And I immediately gutted it and put American Works in it, like you would a Ford into a Ferrari. And so this whole idea of provenance was something that we were also discarding. Does this work now? Oh, you have to push both at once? Bad. Wait, no, you don't push. Where is all that coming from?
Which, right or left?
Let me just try this. Oh, you know what it is? This goes on that. No, just don't point it at this. Just stop. Just stop. I got it. Ming, don't point.
Oh, point at the projector. Of course. Yes, it's working now.
Stand away from the microphone. There you go. And then the other one doesn't.
I didn't touch anything.
This has happened before? How great. We love it. Okay, I got it. I understand. Well, we're getting there.
No, please go reverse on the... That was mine. Excuse me.
No, we have that right. Okay. We were also big believers in the idea of all the social and cultural change that was going to be brought about by the then mainframe computer, which nobody really had in their mind that it was going to evolve into this little kind of desktop thing. But we were very, very convinced that the computer was going to profoundly change architecture. And in many of our early projects, like this one here, we began thinking about some strange sort of metamorphosis of architectural form into electronic form, and the sense that
do you have to tell him that?
What we thought of as the ceremonial stages of architecture were all going to be disappearing. So we got quite committed to all of that and began to move forward. Now, you have to understand that at that point in time, for all of us, this idea of this kind of revolution was completely plausible. We didn't see this sort of, we didn't see this sort of tail end of the postmodern train, the caboose coming along to kind of sideswipe everybody. So this was an article of faith. We're into it, and it turns out that our very first, our very first kind of meaningful, now you can go, commission was the temporary.
You can have one.
No, you have to have both.
No, that's okay.
You have to click both at once.
Oh, you do?
Yes.
Is that right?
So that was our very first meaningful commission. And at this point, Ming gets to take up the story because she was stuck with my indiscretion. There you go.
Something is not working.
Now push that one more time. There you go. That's it. That's where you want to be. No. Right there. Now you push them both simultaneously from here on and you're golden. Trust me.
We didn't rehearse this. This is where we left. This is where we left the lecture the last time we came here. So we thought that we were going to pick it up again from where we left, which was the Tao Library, and we're not going to go through that project, except that the interesting part about it for us is that how we finally understood what temporary architecture really became in terms of what it really means. And at the same time, it was this...
Push forward on both sides.
I am. You know.
I'll tell you what.
I don't think this is working.
Manually?
I
Let's
really
do it manually.
Yeah, I don't think it is working.
Okay, I'm going to actually bash this down. That will work. Okay. So, okay, go forward 2 on this side, on the right-hand side, left-hand side, right-hand side. You're right. Sorry. One more. Back one on that one. Back another. There you go. Now forward on this one. I'm sorry, guys. Okay.
Can you go back on the left-hand side, please? Thank you.
There you go. Okay, Lee.
So this is a kind of a state of affair with temporary nature of architecture, and what was interesting for us was that to understand that most building architecture essentially is really temporary. That you can design a building and it has a certain function. When it gets inhabited, then it takes on a life by its own. So the library, we called it a library, but essentially it was a temporary structure which took on different programming. It became the bookstore throughout the year. The last thing that it was that it couldn't become a dance school because we didn't have concrete floor down there. They have to change it into wood floor. So what we really understood was that when we try to create something permanent, it is so much more incredibly difficult. And this summer, the library just went down was taken down. Everything was recyclable. All the pieces were salvaged, and right now it is sitting underneath a big tarp on the campus of Cal Poly, and hopefully it would turn into the School of Architecture, and then it would not turn into this kind of metamorphosis of
because car designers sort of know that that's going to happen. They know that cycle's going to happen, but for architects, we're kind of very fast aware. And
you have to tell him that. I can't tell him.
Oh, you can't hear me. And Ant Farm isn't always around to rescue it and turn it into still another work of art. Oh, she's fine, and mine is what's not working. Okay. So every once in a while, a project comes along in which we think, aha, we're going to get to wear the hat of a classical architect. And that's really, boy, we get very pumped up for it. And we think this is going to be extraordinary. And each time it's been a kind of a Pyrrhic episode, one that is unfulfilled. But I think in this cycle, we're kind of beginning to catch up. So this was the most classical imaginable commission that we had a shot at about a year ago, to transform Madison Square Garden into a kind of sports gateway to New York. Now, what was attractive about this, really attractive, was that sports are the perfect crossover point between all kinds of culture. It's not an art museum, it's not a theater, it's something which people from high and low culture can equally adapt to. It's something which has built into it all the kind of bravado that Cecil B. DeMille milked out of Quo Vadis, for God's sake. I mean, it's something that has juice, and it's something where ostensibly you can pull out the stops, which is what architects of the past have done. And we've always thought that
there's always different way of telling a story.
Yeah, different ways of telling a story.
You can recreate, and you can create a certain narrative, and the medium to that could be very different, but then the content could be the same.
So one of our private jokes is that probably the guys who built the cathedrals were essentially the same people who are building City Walk. They were really trying to hit on as many levels with as multimedia a kind of experience as it was possible to do. So they're really, you know perfectly well that those stained glass windows in Chartres would have been dancing if they could have made them move, but they couldn't make them move. It was the best they could do. So we came at Madison Square Garden with that kind of thing in mind. We were trying to glue together high and low culture in much the same way that Warhol would do with packaging, things like that, and in the same way that Lichtenstein might have done.
This is one of Lichtenstein's piece at the Ohio State University at the football game. He was commissioned to create arts on the big screen. Every single time there's a what do you call it, when they win a point?
Yeah.
When they have a touchdown.
She's not a native.
We were talking about different culture earlier. So the interesting part about this is that it is one of the art which actually reach across at a certain scale, and we thought about the large scale of sport and the graphic quality of it.
Yeah. The curious thing is that Madison Square Garden in New York City, those of you who've been there, is essentially a big anonymous office tower with a very anonymous kind of drum building associated with it. And it has none of the kind of pumped up kind of adrenaline that one associates with sports. It's not an Arnold Schwarzenegger building. It's more like who is that Arnold guy in the movies? The sort of wimpy guy that I always identify with. Anyway, it's not pumped up. And so the task, as we saw it, was to give this thing some sinew, to put a kind of spin on the old Madison Square Garden that would give it a little more zeitgeist?
Well, just to give a little bit of a background, this was a competition. It was a limited competition, and we were asked to create a program for Madison Square Garden. The only thing that the developer were interested was to have venues which would attract and keep people in Madison Square Garden before they go to the sports, to the stadium, to different kind of entertainment, and on their way out of the subway station. But it was up to us to really invent the program for this project.
So the first thing that we thought was important to do was to superimpose a kind of higher degree of musculature on the building. And we did that essentially by trenching down to the subway, which exits at Madison Square Garden, and creating a very, very large-scale truss element, which goes all the way down to the subway, and then progresses for a whole city block along Madison Square, along 6th Avenue, and to sort of mask the building behind.
And then work with the two different scale all together, because in New York, the scale is for the high rise, and then you have the scale of the pedestrian.
Right. We wanted to bring a kind of carnival kind of atmosphere to that, and bring as much in the way of T-shirt sales and you know, tchotchke sales and hawkers and all the kind of street activity that would actually create a kind of sports venue outside and around the building. And so we worked very, very hard to create a layer of kiosks and sales points and things like that along the face of the building. In an ironic way, about 20 years ago, when Robert and I first arrived in New York, Ray Bradbury had written a story called The Boys Go This Way and the Girls Go That Way. And LA Magazine, for some reason, asked us to illustrate it. And this is the illustration, and I was going through the slides the other day with Ming, and I said, holy cow, this is 20 years it took to do this. This is crazy. But at any rate, there was some of the similar thinking going on in terms of multimedia. This is a little model of it. You can see the ice skating rink glowing down there.
And then the overscale structure.
Oop, we got ahead of. Are you pushing buttons?
I am not doing anything. I'm not holding anything.
Oh, well. Can you get those back in track? I think. Back one more. On the left.
On the left, please.
Another one.
Something.
There we go, okay. Now both together. Ta-da. Always both together. Ta-da. Ta-da. There we go, good, okay. So this is a little section through it that shows the subway concourse coming over. And the scenario was,
well, one of the things was that there was a very large structure on the outside, and what we wanted to do was we wanted to carry that structure all the way into the building, onto the concourse, and using that element, you work with super graphic. At this time, we began thinking about working with artists like Bruce Nauman and other artists who would have create certain art into the concourse. So this is one of the notion that maybe Bruce Nauman would have all of these neon letters on the superstructure.
And then the ice skating rink depressed down to the point where it became actually the finale to your trip out of the subway concourse. And
this is a subway concourse coming up to the ice skating rink.
Okay. There we go. So you can see the ice skating rink over there on the plan. This place is huge. I mean, it's bigger than you can possibly imagine anything being.
That's the entrance to Madison Square Garden up there, and of course there's a precedence with Rockefeller Center and an ice skating rink. But in our case, what we wanted to do was to depress the ice skating rink down onto the subway station, so that there would be a destination point when you get out of the subway station to walk out to the street and come to the ice skating rink there.
Now one of the ways that I know this is not really the way architects are supposed to think about things, but as you begin to confront a project like this, you begin to think very strongly in terms of the audience, the people who are going to use it, and what events and what scenario is going to kind of carry them through it. And so you learn that you can't be shy about making kind of mnemonic gestures. An abstract vocabulary is not going to work. So you look for what in popular songs would be called hooks. Look for something that is going to be a landmark psychologically, landmark emotionally, a landmark in terms of one's sense of resolution of the event that just happened. Because you begin thinking about people going to a sports event, you say, well, wait a minute. There are going to be winners, there are going to be losers, there are going to be crybabies, there are going to be people who are bullies. There's going to be this whole spectrum of human activity coming out of that event after it's finished. And what you're trying to design is a kind of sponge that will give each of them an emotional release in one direction or the other. And so you really truly have to start thinking about a whole spectrum of activities so that everybody can work out whatever their particular emotional trajectory is. And so you'll find that the plans for this kind of work get peppered with words, and they get peppered with events.
It gets peppered with event, which is in our mind would be inhabited by people, so that as you're walking through this very large concourse, then there would be different places on either side, whether it's restaurants, stores, kind of.
So one of the things that we proposed was a big restaurant. It was for the same group of people who were doing dive restaurant, Levy group, and we were trying to create a restaurant which in fact would be the New York equivalent of a sports bar, but it's very, very large. And so this is a section through the restaurant, and you can see we're dealing with the low ceiling height of the office building.
Which is right there.
We decided to take the curse off of that with a big faux blimp. But the idea behind the blimp was that it would have a message board on it, much like the Goodyear blimp does. And you could buy time on it to send a birthday message to your girlfriend, or an anniversary message, or a screw you message to your opponent. So that this big faux blimp was actually an interactive element to allow you to work up some adrenaline. Now, very often in our work, we keep working with little storyboards.
Well, you do.
Well, it's the editorial we. No, we do. At any rate, what we try to do is to think through the experience piece by piece. And generally, these are little tiny sketches, but we just try to think through what the events are being. So this is just an example of that. This is walking through the subway concourse, zipping up above the
escalator, looking down into the ice skating rink.
Maybe having a coffee up above the ice skating, walking across the restaurant.
And then at the same time, above the ice skating rink, we have a very large video screen broadcasting the sport event.
And we actually got very intrigued about the idea of doing a kind of running video up on the canopy above. And then buying a T-shirt. And it's interesting when you look at things at this level, that you really have to then think, well, let's see, we want this thing to be accessible during the day, secure at night, and suddenly you find yourself problem solving at the same moment you're trying to figure out how to sell a hat to somebody. And it's this very strange phenomenon of kind of designing on the run, because you're trying to design at the level of utility and image and transaction all at the same time.
And structure at the same time, because at the same time the kiosk, the glass would come down and close the kiosk, But then the kiosk also would become is the structure and support the canopy of the superstructure.
And it's surrounded with an artwork by a commissioned artist. So we're just trying to mix all of those layers together. Of course, projects like this never get built, so it wasn't. And ITT sold this whole complex to Sheraton, I think, about.
I think they were afraid of the tailgate idea.
You think they were afraid of that one?
Yes.
This came from a Korean restaurant, Ming.
Yes. Yeah. You can have your steak sitting on the, behind this old station wagon, and then, cook your own steak.
It's ethnic. It is.
And that brings us to the next project, which in a very interesting situation. I mean, architects tend to be pigeonholed. You do residence, you always do residence. You do library, you always do library. Except we've done a library, but people never come to us because they thought there was a temporary structure, therefore we can't design a library. And so this next project was for Microsoft.
And you can all start booing now. I know we all have Macs.
Yes. Except when we went up to visit with them, all of their creative work were done with Mac. So that's why we decided to accept the job.
It's true. Every game is designed on a Mac.
Okay.
At any rate, Microsoft came to us a couple of years ago, and again, Ming just said to me as we were driving over here, she has a really hard time thinking about a project unless it has two tracks. Unless it's got a high track and a low track, or somehow it has something other than straight function to it. And I think with the Microsoft project, we initially thought this was really a straightforward thing. And we called up a New York graphic designer that we knew and had worked with who did a lot of corporate identity work. And
we look at Microsoft and we say, this is Microsoft.
We said, this is really corporate. God only knows why they called us. But we better, be Mr. Straight and Mrs. Straight. So we got our ties, we got our New York graphic consultant, went off to Seattle to meet with Microsoft. And it turned out that the reason they called us was because they were entering a game arena and they wanted to be a stealth operation. They didn't want anybody to know it was Microsoft. And they called us precisely because they figured we could kind of dual track this thing.
They wanted to be the new kid on the block, essentially.
Now, from a point of view of appetite, what was very interesting here was that this seemed to be the consummation of this idea of the internet, computer, transitory nature, things being in such a high degree of flux and moving so fast that the old, paths between things were going to be eradicated. And we really wanted to throw all of our energy behind that. So it excited us very much from that point of view. Little tip of the hat, of course, Archigram, as always. Those of you who run into Peter Cook know, they were there way before everybody else. That's an Archigram illustration on the right. They knew it in 1960. Little tip of the hat. For ourselves, our inspiration came from people like the Survival Research Laboratory up in San Francisco, Dennis Oppenheimer, things which were raw, full of energy, with a kind of strange reality.
So that became almost a direct quote for the design of the booth itself. It's as a background, it was shown at the convention center a couple of years ago, and what we wanted to do was we wanted to create a center, a kind of a brain, a central core, which would energize everything else around the booth. And again, this is one of those projects that we were given, when we went up for the interview, essentially they just told us, they said, we have to compete with Nintendo and Sega. And Nintendo and Sega has 30,000 square feet at the convention center. Our booth is going to be right across from them. It's only 7,000 square feet. And we have 3 games we want to introduce, an underwater game, a basketball game, a monster truck game, and that's it. Can you do something about it? So we have to come up with a scenario behind it. We have to, at this point, it's not about geometry, it's not about any of that, but it is about how to engage the people, how to create a certain emotional reaction from them, because we knew that we would have to fight, we have to be louder than anybody else. So, what?
Go ahead.
Wait. So the design was developed with having certain, because we knew that the game, the electronic game is only inside of a monitor screen. And you needed to have iconic element, you needed to have a certain kind of visceral, textural places for people to identify with. So we've created, and for the underwater game, a kind of underwater a representation of that, fairly, I guess, what do you call that?
Literal.
Literal.
Call it literal.
Literal. And then there was for the monster truck, there was a kind of landscape, which is more like a rockscape built out of galvanized metal. And then there's a large steel structure for the windows, which is essentially it's the place where Windows 95 activate all of this different game. So it's more like it's actually the center.
A little bit inspired once again by archograms, the drawing on the left, but the basic thing was this was a sort of a neuron city. And we persuaded Microsoft that it'd be nice to have this sort of neural network at the center, which is where all the sort of Windows games were played. And that network was basically a big kind of elliptical space frame. It's about 70 feet long, the space frame. It's about 25 feet up in the air. And of course, it had to be all prefabricated and put up there. And then inside of it, there are about 100 television sets, and then distorting mirrors a la Brazil, the movie, and, you know, Fresnel lenses and smoke and gas and all of that kind of stuff. So it was the non-literal element. And then the gaming pieces, which were attached to it, were very, very literal. The undersea game, you went up onto that platform and rode down an elevator initially into an undersea environment. These are the models. And the great thing about doing these exhibits, this is about a, what?
3 months.
About a $700,000 exhibit, and it was about 3 months in design and about 3 months in construction. And the fantastic thing is it's non-adversarial. I mean, I would encourage everybody to do at least one of these. It's not like a contractor who is going to nitpick the whole thing to death. The contractor worked in large measure from this model. He gave a price when he saw this model, and then we created drawings and so forth and so on, worked with him hand in hand, and it was extremely symbiotic. We're still very, very good friends. They built the one the year after, and they wanted, you know, they keep calling, and it's great. Absolutely wonderful collaboration. These are some sections through the riptide. We can move quickly through this, can't we, Lee? And that's it as built. Just to give you an example of the contractor's enthusiasm, we thought that that cylindrical piece would be built out of masonite and wood, and he built it all out of steel, because he said he could make a nice patina on it, which is just great. So you're looking now from the deck out toward the neuron center there. This is the monster truck. We had a real monster truck, weighs 12,000 pounds, and it was incredibly difficult to get it installed and to have it move and do all the stuff that it did. And Ming, why don't you talk about this business, because that's fun.
We have to create the rockscape, and one of the things that we couldn't afford is we don't have a highly sophisticated computer system that could just pick up all the point on the model, like Frank Gehry's office, and then create wonderful drawing for the contractor. So the way we designed this was very much like a sculpture. And I just built this model and triangulate the structure, know where the panels are, and this is a 1/2 inch scale model, and you design that rockscape. We gave it to the fabricator, and the fabricator just began to cut all the pieces, mark every single pieces with a red pen after he's finished marking them, cutting them, welding them. So he just used the model as a working drawings, and then just like one-to-one on a daily basis, and just build a real thing.
I was thinking a lot about the people that build Italian car bodies while he was doing that, because it's almost like a lost art, just building the space frame and then covering it with no working drawings. But this is the way it turned out. It's really a vast landscape of galvanized metal on which the monster truck was mounted. And I guess this is one of the other governing images in the thing for our neural network. This is the, the climactic final scene in Close Encounters of Close Encounters of
the first kind.
The third kind.
The third
anyway,
kind.
And at any rate, this is another governing thing. Obviously, we didn't have the budget to do that, but we were trying to give people this sense of awe as they walked in under the neural network. And so we needed to come up with some device. And in thinking about it, we realized that one of the great things that everybody always loves is a ride.
And for people to look at other people going up, because for the water game, we have people walking into this elevator and going down, thinking that they're going down into the ship. And so we thought that we needed to have this other contrasting movement, which is on the outside, for people to go up underneath the brain structure.
Especially since playing computer games is so static, you just stand there and do this. And so we thought we had to have some dynamic movement. And so we kind of cobbled together a moving system. And in our past work, we've had a lot of fun taking things off the shelf and making something else of them. And in this case, actually there's a little genetic trail here. We had been working on an advertising agency and had come across the back windows of Camaros as a kind of architectural element. We thought, boy, these are cool. They're cheap. You can get them for $60 a piece from a junkyard. And we were going to use those as canopies for the advertising agency. Well, that project died, but the idea was still there. And so we were musing about what to do here. And we said, aha, we'll use Camaro backlights for like aircraft canopies up in the air, surround the neural network with it, and then take you up there on a hydraulically actuated seat.
So when you move up there, it's like you're inside a cockpit because you have this canopy above you. So the chair would be lifted up hydraulically from this position up to that position, and then the player can just look into the monitor and play the game.
So there's our intrepid client riding the test seat up and down. That was Bill, a fabricator, and it turned out not to be hydraulic. It's an electric screw jack that takes you up. And you can see there the mock-up of the chair that was first made. And there's the final chair. It has a kind of joystick apparatus that's mounted on a damper that comes down and holds you in the chair. It's like an amusement park ride, so you can't fall out. And it goes up into the air. And then you can watch the monster truck do its gyrations from there. This is the shop where the neural network was fabricated. It's all prefab, and it's loaded onto trailers and trucked off to the convention center.
So it was prefab and then broken into 3 pieces so that they can fit inside the truck.
And Robert probably recognizes this. This was called by a critic an air conditioning system in search of a building. And Robert, I think this is Robert's first building in New York City. It was a daycare center. And I had just met Robert, and he was doing this kind of work, and believe me, a lot of it stuck. I think there's a lot of that in this Microsoft pavilion. The other thing that there's a lot of is, believe it or not, real classical architectural thinking. Because one of the incredible things about architecture, and about things like stairs and ramps and so forth, is that you know within a few inches exactly where somebody's eyes are. You can really track all those vectors when somebody's on a stair or on a ramp. And the kind of thinking that goes into something like the Acropolis, which is well documented, is the kind of thinking that you begin to experience when you're working on a theatrical thing like this exhibit. The other thing, of course, is that, again, one thinks that probably the Greeks were no strangers to this kind of drama. If you think about the caryatid temple in the Acropolis with its sort of, literal representations of people holding up the roof, you realize that the only media they had at hand was marble. But once again, the yearning was very clear to make something which had many, many dimensions. So in our entry sequence to this pavilion, we were tracking very, very, very carefully what your eyes are doing and the drama of that particular entrance. And of course, marking it with monster truck tracks everywhere you went. So it was all over the place.
So it's not unsimilar to movie making in the sense that you really have different point of view. You walk up into the booth to the center from a ramp or up a staircase, and surrounding around the booth would be different game station that we designed.
And again, one of the things that's attractive in terms of at least our process, because you get to design everything from the spoon to the city, as Charlie Moore used to say, because right there is somebody's hand, and their hand is actually within a framework that you've designed. So the whole hand, eye, body framework is something that you can have a great deal of influence over. It did get a little crazy.
The other thing which was really a lot of fun working on this project was a collaboration with a lighting designer, Mark Brickman. And I think that it is so very different from working within an architectural framework, which is when you have to work with the mechanical consultant and the electrical consultant. Craig and I always look at them as like the last level on the totem pole, because they are not very creative, nor they just spec things out of the suite catalog. They're not inventive at all. And we knew that we needed to kind of turn this structure, make it alive, because what Mark Brickman did was that he created a lighting effect which, using just this steel structure, this hunk of steel, and really just make it become alive with all of the different lights and flashing onto it. And it was a lot of fun working with him and trying to understand that.
Yeah, in fact, it's more like a balletic, choreographic kind of relationship that you have with a theatrical lighting designer. And one imagines that one would have the same kind of relationship with a musician and a composer, and where the musician who's actually performing the piece is an extraordinarily talented, creative person as well. So that the dialogue between ourselves, the lighting people, the fabricator, and so forth, is one where the project keeps becoming more and more involving and more emotionally rewarding. Now, since we're still in retrospective framework here, On the left, you're looking at, does the name Sim van der Ven ring a bell to anybody? I'll bet it does to Ray. That's one of the first sort of solar proponent. He was one of the very big solar proponent back in the 60s, Whole Earth Catalog days. And many of us were very, very much involved with the whole ecological kind of idea and very much involved with solar issues of different sorts. Of course, some of it has come to pass, and it was something that we've always been very, very interested in. And about 2 years ago, we finally had the chance to actually have a discourse with solar energy and to try to make an educational device that would help people better understand solar energy. And it's in Germany, this project, in a Frank Gehry building in a city called Bad Oeynhausen. It's a little...
The client is a electrical power companies and in Germany, and they have asked Frank to design a headquarter for them, and at the same time they have this exhibit pavilion where they would like to demonstrate different kind of energy. So the first commission that they wanted, installation that they wanted us to do was on solar energy, and I think both of us have this immediate reaction against solar panel, the things that at least that I always thought that in the 60s and the 70s, solar panel and the technology has really turned it into this very incredibly dry, unromantic, technical things, just like a wrench, for that matter. And so we were really interested.
Tell them what you really think.
So I wanted to really have a different way of talking about the power of the sun, about how incredibly valuable it is, that it is a different way of understanding the universe and the sun. It's not just something that you turn on the switch and you have light and power.
So as we talked about this, we realized that we had to kind of connect with myth and pageant and the ceremonial aspects of solar power, the kind of sense of wonder and awe, as well as the technical sense. And that we had to, that maybe some of the touchstones and ways to connect these things were to have very self-evident mechanical devices, and at the same time to suggest some metaphorical reality outside of them, and that the exhibit would in some way take place between those two spaces rather than being more linear or more descriptive. And so we talked a lot about Laurie Anderson and the incredible way that she had elevated all this technology that she uses into a plane which is purely artistic. And we also talked at the same time about Leonardo and about the guy that wrote Pneumatica, Hero, and the sense that thank you, and the way in which Hero would take an absolute physical principle and translate it into something magical. So this was the building, which was already magical enough. It was under construction at the point when we were asked to begin designing the exhibit. And it was real scary because we hadn't worked with Frank before. And
we were asked to do something not only inside of the building, but outside of the building. And the interesting part about this project is that it sits on a highway like Route 66 in the United States. It's just like that. And there's like hundreds of trucks driving by in front of this building. It's in a small town, so this is a major highway. So we one day just went across the street with Frank, and we began taking a lot of photographs of all of this truck, and we realized, and I don't think he admits it, that that shape might generate the shape of the exhibit pavilion.
And what we decided to do on this sort of mythological path, when we went to Germany to check this out, we realized here we are sitting in Southern California, and you think, oh, sun's everywhere, it's really plentiful, there's, we're drenched in it. And you go to Germany, which is actually on Montreal's latitude, this particular town. And so the sun sets very, very early, and it rises very, very late. You only have little smidgens of sun. And we came back and we started saying, gosh, this is something where we've really got to deal with sun as a limited resource, not as an endless one. And Ming coined this term, no more daisies, which became the mantra for the show, that maybe if there weren't any more sunlight, all the things that we know and love about the world will dry up and go away. And so that our point of departure was one of a kind of poignant lack of sunlight. And we painted the interior of the exhibit hall black and admitted sun only through a very narrow slit, which came off of those two heliostats that you see on the right-hand side there. And we sort of thought of them as pince-nez, but they direct a very narrow beam of sunlight into the studio.
So it is very much about working with dichroic mirror, what your eyes can see. It is about being able to see the sun rays and activating an entire exhibit different pieces inside a very dark room. So the two heliostats from the outside would be projecting the different sun rays into this kind of upside down boat of a exhibit space. And then the different mirror and dichroic mirror would be suspended, hung from the ceiling, and it would then reflect and activate, coming down, would be reflected on the different exhibit next. Well, one of the things that we always have to do with this kind of exhibition is that we call that proof of concept. You have to, in order to convince a client that this thing is going to work, you have to show them that it's going to work at a smaller scale. So we built this model in our office.
Is that not working? At any rate, we did a lot of experimentation with mirrors, with motors, with electronic circuits to demonstrate the reality of these concepts and make them work. And then finally, again, with one of these fabricators that we love to work with out in San Fernando Valley, built the exhibit. And it was very interesting because this is a very highly technical exhibit requiring minute adjustments of mirrors and so forth to make them all reach their appointed destination. And we thought, this is great. We're going to build this exhibit. We're going to build it in Germany. We're going to have German craftsmanship. This is going to be the most impeccable thing you can possibly imagine. So we went to Germany with the plans and met with complete panic on the part of German fabricators because they are not used to the kinds of things that the Los Angeles culture is used to. They're not used to doing things.
They're not used to improvise.
They're not used to anything which does not have strict lines of demarcation. So it turned out that the only place in the world that we could build this, literally, was in San Fernando Valley. It was the only place where all the full spectrum of skills to build this existed. And to give you an idea of the kinds of challenges, these needles on those big dials that you saw, they're about 8 feet long. And the needles needed to reflect the passage of the sun. If a cloud goes across the sun, the needle wants to dip instantaneously and come back up instantaneously. And so the mechanics to make that happen required a great deal of experimentation and required a contractor who really knew his stuff to do it. And we went through all kinds of different systems, hydraulic, stepper motors, etc., before we got that to work.
So the one of the elements that we wanted to do was to compare the old and the new. We were interested in showing the people different appliances and juxtapose them with new appliances and for them to understand. So we have like television sets and radio and turntable. And the part which is so interesting is the only thing which hasn't changed was the toaster. The toaster remained the same size. Everything changed in the same size. And shrouding and just kind of wrapping, we called it shrink wrapping the table. So we shrink wrapped all the appliances and the table with zinc. So it would look monolithic, except for the modern appliances, which can therefore be replaced every year. But the old appliances and the table would be covered with zinc and carved with pattern of the sun on the table. And we call this a table of consumption. And
the idea was that if when you turn that sort of Frankensteinian switch to one side, it gives you the classical power, and to the other side, it gives you the contemporary power back on those dials. Oh, and there's the toaster Ming was talking about.
And at the same time, you can raise with the sun. There was a square meter of
solar cell.
And when there would be the sun on one side, this arrow would move up, and then you can raise with it. And that's the arrow that Craig was talking about, where it has to be built very light, so that it can move with your movement instantaneously.
And then we found, an old beat-up dial, a very small dial that water had leaked on and that was stained and looked used, and replicated that for the large-scale dials because we really didn't want this to have the authority or the appearance of being something that was fresh. So all of the patina and so forth and so on was accomplished to kind of try to reduce the threat that people would feel in using this equipment.
And I think we were trying to work with the two different scales inside of the exhibit hall. One, again, which is at the level which is a human scale, and the other one, I keep on thinking about Metropolis with this very large die hung on the ceiling.
So we'll run through just the other aspects here quickly. We wanted to keep track of the time that there was sun in the place, and analog records seem to be a pretty good way of keeping track. So we constructed a very large wheel. And once again, there's something wonderful about the geometry of a very large wheel. It's very mythical. Artists tap into it all the time. Chris Burden on the right, Cocteau on the left. And so we thought it'd be wonderful to make a sun tracking wheel. And on the left, you see the small experiment we did with a little magnifying glass out in our backyard at the studio. And then on the right, you see the inlaid discs, which last for you have a 3-month LP of the sun's travel here.
It's about 12 feet in diameter. Essentially what happened is that the sunlight would come, hit the mirror, go down through the Fresnel lens, and then would burn a track, and then the disc would rotate 24 hours rotation. That's the revolution.
One revolution per day.
One revolution per day, and it would just go inwards for every season.
So that's the disc and the apparatus above it. And then the thing which turned out to be the big crowd pleaser was what we called a solar organ. And the idea behind the solar organ was that you would have all the rays of the sun coming down onto a keyboard, and you would pass your hand over between the sun and the keyboard, and you would trigger a MIDI system with a soundscape upon it, which gave forth cosmic sounds. So we had in mind composers like Ligeti and Messiaen, and people that dealt with very kind of black arts very often in their music. And we built we got a Casio, electronic keyboard, and gutted it, made a proof of concept, which is what that is, and then began thinking about how to orchestrate and how to position this keyboard and all those pieces there. And I'm a little bit of a fetishist about the moving of the obelisk in the center of St. Peter's Square, and it seemed like a good opportunity. And also a bit of a fetishist about Tycho Brahe and all of the ways in which architecture participated in making cosmic measurements. And so we sort of morphed those two ideas together to create the solar organ, which looks a bit like this. Now that's San Fernando Valley craftsmanship. It's about a 8-foot diameter arc with beautifully welded metal pieces and beautifully glued steel all through it. That's the big calibrator for the mirrors, which bring the light down onto the keyboard. There you see the entire organ minus its cloak. We thought it'd be a little more mysterious if we put it behind like a magician's curtain, so that you would approach the organ through a curtain into a kind of sanctum. And that's the keyboard with our client's hand hovering over it. All the electronics are, actually Robert, again, there is such a resonance here, and I'm looking at Robert right here, that the very first project that Robert and I worked on was a creative plaything store in New York, which had an electronic sound game throughout the whole store, which allowed children to interact with it and compose their music as they went along. And this is a very, very similar kind of spatial activity in that people go and play the organ.
So you can wave your hand above all of this plexi tube, and then it would activate the sound. And then, of course, it was important for us to hold on to the myth of the sun, to the myth of Apollo. So we have this cast of Apollo with the company's logo Panta-Ray at the bottom.
We asked the Getty if they would loan us one to take the cast out, and they said, no thank you, we'd rather not. And so once again, San Fernando Valley to the fore. We made a small maquette, and they carved it in 3 days, cast it in concrete, patinaed it very lovingly, and shipped it to Germany. It weighed about 8,000 pounds. But it survived. Actually, I kept hoping maybe they'll drop it. It'll get more real.
Yes, then you can put together all the fragments.
They handled it almost too carefully. So we only have one. Is that right?
Yes, I think this next project is. What happened is that the first 3 projects is what kept us alive. It kept our interest. Because we actually could get to build something. You can experiment. You can see it physically. 6 months later, you can touch it. And this next project was a project that took us 10 years to finally see that maybe it's going to be built. And it is It is a project up in on Hollywood Boulevard. It's for a non-profit institution, the American Cinematheque, and we have been. They started Filmex in Los Angeles. So we have been for the last 10 years working with them, looking at all of the different sites. And 2 years ago, they were lucky that this is the only time that the earthquake was a benefit. And the earthquake hit the Egyptian theater in Hollywood Boulevard. So the CIA, the Community Redevelopment Agency, decided to sell or donate the property to the American Cinematheque. So our next project is really on this location, which is extremely touristy. It was built by Sid Grauman. It's right opposite of the Chinese theater, and it was actually built before the Chinese Grauman theater. So very much the sidewalk and the hieroglyph, the notion of the Egyptian theater was something that we immediately thought about. Hollywood, the stage set, and all of the things that came with it, and the history of it, which is so different from how we approach a historical building in Europe. In this situation, Hollywood is historical, and I have a very difficult time reconciliating a historical building which is not 1,000 year old or 2,000 year old. And here, this project is considered historical for Los Angeles, and it's only 40 years old.
That's right, and it's also a faux building to begin with, but the stick-to-itiveness of the Cinematheque actually was, I think, what allowed us to continue to trust that this project was going to happen. The original founders of the Cinematheque had come from the Filmex. They actually created Filmex, Gary Essert and Gary Abrahams. And they carried this project forward with enormous fervor and were very, very inspiring. And we searched with them for a site, as Ming said. It was almost like an odyssey. And unfortunately, AIDS took them both about 3 or 4 years ago. And Barbara Smith, who was the manager for the project, continued forward, and she just buttoned down, man. She just said, I'm going to make this happen. And she literally, I think, it's the kind of client anyone would kill for, because she had so much stamina and so much vision that this was going to happen. So it was very inspiring for our whole crew to work on the project. It had been, as Ming said, pretty beat up. Those holes on the side of the Cinematheque of the Egyptian theater are like 40 feet square. And the facade,
so that's a
over
state
the years,
that we inherit,
yeah.
The building.
Now, its past was pretty interesting when you get into the sort of forensic work and try to imagine what was this building in the first place. Interestingly enough, it never had a marquee when it was built. The space simply flowed right into the courtyard. And then as motor cars became more prevalent and pedestrians started disappearing from the street, they found they had to put up a marquee and begin announcing themselves to passing motorists.
But that's an urban pattern. It's very typical on Hollywood Boulevard that you would have a forecourt that would take you back into it. So as we study Hollywood Boulevard, and you always have those kind of courtyard into the middle of the block.
Anyway, went through many transformations. Finally, in the 50s, Mike Todd got hold of it and 50ized it. He removed the Egyptian columns, which were at the end of the courtyard, lowered the ceiling, put in a hung ceiling, removed the fancy proscenium arch, and put this sort of swoopy facade on it. leaving the task of identity to the script. At one time it had neon on that marquee, but in the 60s and 70s, even that proved too difficult. That was removed, and this is the state in which we got it. These are the glory days. Openings were just phenomenal. Absolutely packed. It was one of the venues in all of Los Angeles.
They would have somebody walking up
Oh yeah.
up there dressed as a Bedouin. When they have an opening, there was, and I think that we wanted to hold on to that certain kind of, for us, the historical aspect has less to do with the recreating the architecture, but more recreating that experience of an opening of a movie in Hollywood Boulevard. There was the old proscenium with columns, which right now has been removed in the 60s.
So it made provisions for a wide screen. In retrospect, even though it was a really horrible thing to do, the fact that they were removed made it possible to have a viable motion picture theater there today. Because if it weren't possible to have a wide screen, we would have been into there would have only been the opportunity to show very antique films there, and it wouldn't have been viable.
There are certain things that that we wanted to keep. One of that is a sunburst gold leaf decoration on the ceiling of the theater, and it is also act like a speaker, because at that time during silent movie there would be organ playing, and then the sound of the organ would come out through those holes on the ceiling. And on the other hand, there are things which in the lobby are definitely not worth keeping, because there were really bad painting in the 60s of some Egyptian motif there, and we will not be keeping them. So this is this kind of a dialogue between decision of what you wanted to maintain and what you cannot. Right now, after the earthquake, the construction has a lot of, those are hollow clay tie. Most of them fell down. We need to restructure the entire building seismically. So the whole and the shell of the theater really is nothing but a skeleton. What you're looking over here is the projection booth above. At that time, the theater, designed for 1,500 seats, was a very strange shape, because half of the theater seating were underneath the projection booth, underneath a very low ceiling. And with the new program, what we have to do was to create a smaller theater, and this is our first scheme, where we have a smaller theater, maybe 2 screening rooms within the envelope of the existing shell. The first notion was to bring back the proscenium, the decorative proscenium. In this situation, we were proposing to lower them down when the Cinematheque was going to show old movie, 16mm movie, when they don't need a large screen.
But this scheme was before all the real incredible realities of showing motion pictures in the 80s and 90s, 2000, year 2000, came upon us. One of the first things that we encountered, because this was a speculative scheme at that point, was that the shape of the theater with its curved walls meant that surround sound wasn't a possibility.
But it was really good for organ playing.
It was great for organ. You got all that resonance. You got a wonderful, rich quality from it. But what you need in a contemporary theater is absolute dead space, no echoes. And it wasn't possible to reclothe those walls, because from a historical point of view, it was very important to keep those walls in their present state. And so, bit by bit, as the realities of projection, acoustics, and sightlines intruded into our speculation, but in a very positive way, we realized that perhaps the only solution to it was to hot rod it in the best American tradition and superimpose another structure upon the theater, which would allow you to appreciate the old theater, but also have a full state-of-the-art theater experience. So our final scheme really involved compressing the audience into a kind of rectangular space and confining that rectangular space with movable walls.
And at the same time, create a lobby inside of the theater, because the old lobby of the theater is very small. That's this linear place here. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to create a new lobby, have a small screening room, and insert another theater about 600 square feet. So those are the three new programs inside of the old theater.
That's not this theater, but it's an analog. That very small screen and that very huge volume would not have been tolerable in today's world.
It's the same analogy for us as watching television in the 60s when you have a very small screen, and now everybody have a huge television, which is the wall of the living room. Most people, I don't think that we do. But.
So one of our mantras then came to be, okay, if we're going to put this new artifact within the old artifact, then perhaps we can deal with the genuine quality of the existing Egyptian theater in a more sophisticated European way, as opposed to updating it a la Disney. That we can leave the scars, the patina, the age marks on the old theater and insert the new theater into it, and in a sense truss up the old one so that it will no longer be a threat to life and safety. So in a sense we were beginning to devise a strategy which celebrated the old material and inserted some new material into it.
And then trying to keep them very separate.
Exactly.
So that they just constantly are confronting each other.
So we're really talking about the kind of beauty that you find in Thebes and in those artifacts, and allowing the age to show. So this is a section through the courtyard and the theater. In the courtyard, we're going to fully restore the Egyptian columns. And we hope we can make them in the same scene shop that made them in the first place, but probably not.
And then we introduce the palm trees to make it part of the ceremonial entrance into the theater. And it is a sequence of coming down into the theater, going down into the lobby, and walking into a different place. And it's not unsimilar to this insertion of this engine, because we were looking at designing the theater very much like the way a camera works. That at this time it was important for us that it has to perform acoustically, it has to work and give the brightest image. And so we create this armature that we inserted inside of the theater. And the armature not only, it has to fulfill all of the different requirements, but the armature really has to work with the historical aspect of the theater, because we can't touch the old wall, we cannot hang anything from the ceiling, we cannot hang anything from the wall, we cannot put acoustical panel onto the existing concrete wall. So the armature has to be self-sufficient. And
so the theater experience that we envision is when you walk into the theater, the side walls and the ceiling are brightly lit, and the armature is a skeleton that you see through. And then you take your seat, And instead of the curtain going up, the screen is always there, the walls come out and enclose you as the lights go down. And then the movie starts. These are some study models and drawings of the armature and the walls that will move along.
So that the armature would have...
Oh, I'm sorry. I got impatient.
That's right, you got very impatient. So what it became was that the armature was essentially a different building because it has a structure and it holds a mechanical duct. It supports the light, it supports the sprinkler. So it's kind of a mini version of the Tower Library inserted inside of the Egyptian theater.
We sort of saw a timeline, even though it's a kind of faux timeline, going from Contemporary Street in a linear way through the courtyard, which refers to the ancient past, and then emerging into the more contemporary zone.
That's a model.
Next. Some models. More models.
The baffle.
Yeah, those are the baffles.
The baffle.
Which will move back.
No, but these.
Oh, and those baffles there.
These would absorb all of the light, so that the only thing you see would be this bright screen.
If you look inside of your Nikon or whatever through when you're loading the film, and you look at the way light is managed within the lens, you'll see that there are all of these beveled surfaces to keep light from bouncing off the sidewalls of the lens and into the film plane and diluting the film image. So we tried to apply that very same inside of the camera kind of technology to this, and so that the sidewalls will be as black as we can possibly make them to increase the luminosity of the image on the screen. And it will be, in fact, I think the largest screen in Los Angeles. It's about 85 feet wide. So, good size. The courtyard will be
this is where we
restored.
Begin our timeline.
This is where we begin the timeline.
For us, Hollywood Boulevard is the historical side of it. Not the building, but it's Hollywood Boulevard because it brings a certain nostalgia to the people. And
there you see the columns that are left, which is really crazy. And then in the model form, the new columns that'll be there. And this is just a little storyboard of what we hope the experience will be as you approach the main portico. Portico itself will be only moderately lit, but there will be a kind of stargate of a very lowered portion, which was the original entry, where we'll cook you. We'll just have an enormous amount of light in there as you pass through that. And the donors' names and so forth will be illustrated on either side. And that's an approximation of the lighting.
Of light and dark. Most people would think that the larger space should be very brightly lit, but we wanted to kind of compress people into that space. And then when you walk into the lobby, then you are confronted with the old entrance into the theater, except at this time we're stripping all the wall and leaving the portals of that wall. And as you approach it, then you look down into the lobby.
Because there's the historical ceiling's quite low. It's about 9'6" to maybe 11 feet. And
it's lower than that.
Oh yeah, much lower than that. And so we need to, it's down at the green line back there.
So we need to excavate down in order to create enough height for both the lobby and the screening room.
And the other interesting and to us really exciting thing was you couldn't touch that ceiling because it was historical. And we wanted to preserve as much view into it as we possibly could. So we devised a kind of a curved, that'll give you an image of how low that ceiling is, the excavation to it. And we devised this kind of curved, low ceiling, which actually floats free of the actual ceiling of the building, almost like the lid of a sarcophagus. And the image we had in mind was literally one of excavation, in which the sarcophagus had been exhumed from the earth. And you walk down to gain entry into the screening room, and the ceiling of the sarcophagus actually begins about waist height from your entry level, if you part down from it.
So you're looking over the ceiling,
then the name
over
of the
the
prime
curved
donor,
ceiling.
of course, will be in gold leaf on that roof. It'd be sort of like that, hovering up under the other roof. And then as you pass into the theater itself, you see there on the left the theater walls seen through the armature and lit, and
so that you can look at the old theater and see the old painting and the sculpture before the movie begins. And then when the movie begins, what we thought was that most of the time in the old movie theater, the curtain opens up. And what we wanted to do was, we wanted to do the reverse, is that when the movie begins, the acoustic panel would close you inside of the theater.
And in fact, there will be an acoustical change, which will be really wild. You'll go from a resonant space to a dead space. Just a study model.
Now it's on the wrap.
Right now, that's its condition right now. It'll open in October. It's well under construction, actually moving like a rocket ship. Eric Holmquist, who is our project architect on it, has been extraordinarily devoted.
He sleeps there.
He sleeps there. I mean, it's amazing. And Turner Construction, I really should mention them too, because they have their full soul and energy into this project. It's one of the most completely fulfilling projects you could possibly imagine. I'll be quite happy to hang up my hat after this is finished, if that's the case, because
it's going to take another 10 years to build.
Well, it's going to take another 10
old
years to find a project that's as fulfilling as this, for sure. So I hope next October you guys are among the first patrons.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Oh, perfect. Hour and a half. Perfect. Hour and a half. Perfect. An hour and a half.